After what was undoubtedly a hectic Saturday, considering the cancellation of my wedding moments before my wife, with whom I am now separated, and I exchanged our vows, after nearly making a disastrous mistake at work that might have cost me my job, after an uncomfortable encounter with a mustachioed stranger, and forgetting my lines at what was touted to be our town's most important theater production of the decade, I decided I deserved to spend my Sunday as I saw fit, with no obligations, errands, nor public appearances, despite the countless responsibilities that fell upon my shoulders to ensure the daily operations of the town ran without interruption or complications. I would take the day off. Of course, taking the day off was no small task in its own right. I couldn't simply call my employer, Mr. H.W. Towns, founder and president of H.W. Towns Insurance and Associates, and say, "Oh, Mr. Towns, yes, it's Arthur Kurtz. I beg your pardon for calling you at such an early hour, but I'm feeling under the weather and won't make it in today." There were countless reasons I couldn't take the easy road here. Most importantly, reporting I was sick would be an enormous lie. In fact, I hadn't felt better in months. With the weight of my wedding preparations off my shoulders and, somewhat unfortunately, the realization that Julia and I weren't suited for marriage, I felt like a new man, so to speak. Additionally, taking a day off would be a surefire bet to double my work the following day. It's not as if the work puts itself aside and thinks, "Let's give the old fellow a break, especially with what he's been through." No, the work continues to pile up twofold, even if I were gone for such a short amount of time that not even a speck of dust could settle on my ledgers. I arrived early at H.W. Towns Insurance and Associates and sat down at my desk. I made a short but thoughtful to-do list and checked the time. It was 6:29 a.m., giving me an uninterrupted 2.5 hours of work before my colleagues would arrive at 9 a.m., at which point I would leave for the day. Well, most likely I wouldn't leave immediately. I'd owe them the professional courtesy of engaging in small talk, asking them how they were doing and inquiring about their families. "How's your weekend coming along?" and "no rest for the weary" were my phrases of choice. On the surface, of course, such conversations seem inane, but I found that a little chit-chat here and there works wonders for morale for those of us in the trenches, as we like to say. And I must admit there was a selfish angle to my design. Giving an air of sociability and fostering a we're-all-in-it-together atmosphere sneakily gives me the appearance of a natural leader, which is crucial if I'm ever going to make partner at H.W. Towns Insurance and Associates. My goodness. Imagine me, a partner at H.W. Towns Insurance and Associates. I wonder if Mr. H.W. Towns would change the name of the firm immediately, or if I'd need to prove myself a capable partner first. H.W. Towns and Kurtz Insurance and Associates has a nice ring to it, although the two names together are quite a mouthful. Perhaps I could convince him to drop H.W. out of the name altogether, and we could change the name to Towns and Kurtz Insurance and Associates. But that would be too much to fit on a sign. Towns and Kurtz Insurance. Yes, that's the one. I made a note to discuss this with Mr. H.W. Towns when the time came. My daydream was cut short by church bells ringing out across the city center, echoing off the limestone of City Hall. I expected to hear the bells chime 7, so imagine my shock when they struck 11:30. I had wasted hours in a foolish reverie, and the prospect of taking a restful day off was dwindling. Not only was it far later than I imagined, but I also found myself alone in the office. A sense of tremendous frustration squeezed at my temples when I remembered that it was, of course, a Sunday. I took off my glasses and rested my head on my desk in exasperated defeat. Already, my day was off to an irritating start, and now I'd wasted nearly the entire morning. Upon waking up, I'd even gone so far as to say, "Today I will spend my Sunday as I see fit," but then, ever a creature of habit, I'd gone about my morning as if it were any other day. Had I really let my professional life encroach so far that it had conquered my personal life? Well, I would put an end to that now. I resolved to no longer let work interfere with my personal life. Starting today, Work comes second, I said to myself. I realized, however, that there would be times that work would need to come first. Here and there, I would surely have late nights, especially when working under a deadline set by Mr. H.W. Towns, requiring me to work into the early hours of the morning, perhaps even necessitating I sleep at my desk to catch a few hours of rest before my daily meeting with the board at 10:30. But such occurrences would be few and far between. In any event, I would have fair notice that a late night was in store for me, and I could arrange my social and personal obligations accordingly. So I suppose work could still come second, however conditionally. As I packed up my bag, I wondered if I should leave a note on Mr. H.W. Towns' desk on the sly, a clever overture to indicate that I had put in some extra hours on a Sunday morning. I couldn't explicitly say that I had been working. It would be silly to write, "Dear Mr. H.W. Towns, I wanted to bring to your attention that I worked this Sunday." No, that would be outright sycophancy. Instead, perhaps I could write, "Dear Mr. H.W. Towns, while I was in on Sunday, I came across X, Y, and Z, and what have you." Yes, that might do the trick. However, what if Mr. H.W. Towns had a violent reaction upon discovering I was in an entire office by myself, using precious coal to heat the office, wasting money on electricity so that I might work by the lamplights? Goodness, he could terminate my employment then and there. And worse, he could call in an auditor and make a strong case against me for inappropriate use of company resources. I'd be lucky to escape with simple litigation in court. More likely, I would be facing jail time. My professional reputation, and not to mention my good name, would be ruined. No, it'd be better if I wrote no note at all and left things as they were when I arrived. Regardless, no note was left behind. I'd been daydreaming so intensely about what might or might not have happened had I left a note that I didn't realize that I had left the office and was already blocks away. The ting-ting bell of a streetcar snapped me back into reality, and I took a moment to gather my bearings. I found myself in a crowd in front of the memorial of St. Nikolai. A clanging tram winds down Wolberstiegstrasse. Pedestrians scrambled out of its way and onto the sidewalks to let it pass, when a young boy flying a kite ran into the road, directly in the path of the train. "He's going to get hit!" I shouted, but no one made any indication that they had heard me, or worse yet, that they even cared. "Someone, save the boy!" I cried. Again, no one responded. I fumed. Had the citizens of our once great town become so self-absorbed that even the impending, gruesome death of a young boy couldn't distract them from their selfish pursuits? I resolved that I would need to write a speech for the next city council meeting. It couldn't be directly accusative out of the gate. No, I would need to get in the audience's good graces first so that they would listen to me with an open mind. First, I would extol the great virtues and customs, if any remained, of our little town, rather than lambast those in attendance. I would suggest that we be more mindful of one another and, once again, act as a community that can rely on one another in our moments of most dire need. I'd already had a few sentences ready in my head when the ting-ting of the streetcar rang out again with more urgency. The child didn't notice. It was up to me to save him. "Make way!" I screamed and bolted into the road, nearly tripping on the cobblestone, grabbed the boy by his arms, and did a barrel roll into the gutter as the tram charged by with mere seconds to spare. The child held on to his kite yet, and it climbed higher into the sky. I was ready to shout at the boy for his deadly lack of attention, and I must admit my first instinct, which I of course stifled, was to crack him with the back of my hand, when a strong hand grabbed me on the shoulder and turned me around. I beheld a squat man with a small face, wide nose, and dark eyes set beneath thick black eyebrows. Tears streamed down his chubby cheeks as he pulled me in for a tight embrace. "My boy! You saved my boy!" he cried into my shoulder. I patted him on the back as I swallowed my anger. I must admit my first instinct was to lay into this man for so carelessly neglecting his child, but I was moved by his vulnerability and gratitude. I gently pushed him away, holding him by his arms. His blue wool double-breasted coat scratched at my palms. Big brass buttons ran parallel from his collarbone down to his belly beneath a satin white sash that said Mayor in big black letters. I realized then that it was Mayor Sifkas. I had saved the mayor's boy! He swallowed hard, nodded, exhaled with a sense of tremendous self-assurance, and removed his sash. He put it over me and patted me on the shoulders. "No person in this city deserves this more than you," he said, choking down tears. "I hereby pass on the honor and responsibilities of mayor to you, and I officially resign." He bowed with a flourish. He got back up and hugged me once again and whispered into my ear with wet breath, "Thank you. Truly." Before I could respond, I was clasped by the wrist and pulled away by a man wearing a black suit with a black tie and black hat, his face plastered with a serious glare. "Mayor or not, Herr Kurtz, you're late," he barked. He pulled me down Wolbergsteinstrasse. I looked over my shoulder and watched the former Mayor Sifkas fall to his knees and embrace the boy. The child held on to the kite, his eye fixed on the sky. What a strange child, I thought. Perhaps he was shy, or perhaps kite flying was his true passion, his raison d'etre. I couldn't help but feel a tinge of jealousy. I searched my mind, but I couldn't think of a single activity or passion of my own to which I devoted so much emotional capital. For years, I've been blinded by my zeal to make partner at H.W. Towns Insurance and Associates. And for what? Sure, it would grant me a certain social standing and a more than bit of financial security, but would that be enough to qualify as a legacy? A sense of deep shame washed over me. I'd been so blinded by my work that I'd neglected myself. Maybe it was time for me to quit, or at the very least, take a long vacation. I'd read about the French Riviera, and that piqued my interest well enough. Although, come to think of it, I'm not too fond of sand, nor would I consider myself that strong of a swimmer. I'm easily prone to seasickness, so a pleasure cruise was also out of the question. I scanned my mind for more options, but came up short. At first, I cursed myself for such a lack of imagination. When I realized that it wasn't a matter of being unimaginative, I simply hadn't read enough travel magazines. Now there was a place to start to pull me out of the doldrums. I could read about exotic places to sharpen my worldly curiosities and perhaps, in time, settle on a vacation spot that would perfectly suit my interests. I was about to ask the man to stop pulling me along so I could stop at a newsstand and get a travel magazine when I found myself in an old Victorian home in a long line of people in black, queuing against the wall of a large parlor. They were all sniffling, wearing black suits, black dresses, and black veils. The man finally let go of my wrist and folded his arms in a huff. "What on earth are you wearing?" he whispered with more than a hint of venom. He pulled the mayor sash over my shoulders, wadded it up in a ball, and hid it in his breast pocket. I was ready to raise my voice and demand he return it when I realized where I was. I was in Monsieur Beaupre and Son's funeral home, in a long line of mourners. The scene felt vaguely familiar, like I had been here before, as if the whole situation had been practiced. I couldn't for the life of me put a finger on it when I found myself in front of the open casket. I peered in, and the deceased was no other than Keir Delay, an actor made famous by his role as the leading man in Casablanca. His face was pancaked with white grease paint, so much so that it was like the Undertaker had tried to make a living man appear dead. I crossed myself in the name of the Father and the Son and the what have you, and turned around to see the entire crowd at the funeral home seated and staring at me. Blinding lights hung from the ceiling, and I couldn't make out anyone's faces. However, it was clear they were ready for a speech. I could feel the blood drain from my face and my knees wobbled, but I regained my composure, took a deep breath, and cleared my throat. "It's times like these," I began. I floundered for a moment until a perfectly ordered set of words came to mind, as if I were pulling them from a book. I continued, "That we remember life is about meetings and partings." I felt like I was plagiarizing some passage, but I felt I had the whole attention of the room. "We'll never forget our dear friend here. and I will carry his memory in my heart all the year." "Cut! Bravo!" shouted a man in the back. One by one, the lights shut off with a ka-chunk. The mourners sat up and clapped. A man with a cardboard megaphone chewing on a cigar cheered as he made his way through the crowd. "Excellent! Purely excellent!" the director cried, clapping all the while. "Delivered perfectly." I felt a pat on my back and turned around. Keir Delay was sitting up in the coffin, rubbing the grease paint off his face with a handkerchief. He smiled and winked, conveying a professional congratulations for a job well done. I remembered then that I had been acting in a film at nights and on weekends for the past few months. We'd finally wrapped the final scene, and now the film was up to the editors to cut together. A great sense of relief washed over me. What's more, I thought of the boy with the kite. I was flying a kite of my own all along, pursuing my great passion for acting. I'd simply been so blinded by my ambition to make partner at H.W. Towns Insurance and Associates that it was as if I was leading two lives, one of which I floated through almost subconsciously. I remembered the vow I made to myself earlier in the day. Starting today, work comes second. I felt so happy that I caught myself whistling, walking with a certain bounce in my step, when I felt a chill in the air that knocked me out of my daydream. I quickly realized that I had no idea where I was. I must have wandered right off set in a cheerful daze, and now I was quite lost. I was walking down the middle of a muddy country road, and the sun was setting over the hills. I spun around and saw the city was far behind me, its lights flickering in the twilight. To think, after saving the boy and with all that talk about the inhabitants of my town acting so self-possessed that they were blinded to their immediate surroundings, here I was, in the middle of nowhere, with no memory of how I'd arrived. I debated turning back around and heading towards the city, but by now the sun had set. I feared it was too dark to wander back down the road, and I would likely get even more lost, and who knows where I would end up. I turned to my right, and thankfully, I noticed that I was in front of a towering church. Torches were lit on either side of the doors, inviting me in. I made my way up the steps when I saw a sign tacked on the door. It read, "Sundays, 8 p.m. to 9 p.m. Confession." I looked at my watch. It was 8:15 p.m. I couldn't simply enter the church and sit in the back, warm up, and then beg a poor parishioner for a ride into the city. It would lack integrity. No, if I were to ask for a ride into town, I had to agree to the terms on the door. I would need to confess some sins so that I might ask a fellow Christian for a ride with a clear conscience. However, I'd hardly consider myself a practicing Christian. In fact, I wasn't even baptized. My name is Arthur Kurtz, plain and simple, without a Christian middle name. I'd never engaged in any sacrament, let alone the sacrament of reconciliation. However, I'd read enough books to know the score. "Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned," and what have you. But I couldn't put on a show because, like I said before, it would lack integrity. I would need to mean it. Besides, it could be a fine balm for the soul to admit some sin and hear aloud one of my many shortcomings. It could put me on a path to lead a better life. A life where I flew kites, took time for myself, and lived as a thoughtful and considerate neighbor. I was so wrapped up in ruminating over whether or not I would engage in the sacrament that I must have wandered into the confessional, for I found myself sitting in the dark on the other side of a sliding door. I had just come out of my daydream and couldn't remember if a priest were on the other side of the door, or, what's more, if he had said anything to me yet. I desperately scanned my conscience for a sin. I would blurt it out and just go from there. "Think, Arthur," I told myself. I reflected on my day, working backwards. I had done well in my movie scene, yes, but I had also nearly arrived too late, much to the chagrin of the man in the black suit and black hat, who I remembered now was my agent, with whom I had a fraught relationship based on my absent-mindedness and general lack of punctuality. I had saved a boy, sure, but then I felt shame again over the anger I felt at my fellow citizens, and felt further humiliated over not having a kite of my own, so to speak. My life was purely driven by advancing at work and making partner at H.W. Towns Insurance and Associates. Yes. I came upon the sin that I needed to confess. That morning, I had burned precious coal to heat an office, for one, then seriously debated, an underhanded trick to leave a note, dripping with pride, bragging about my commitment to work, lacking any sense of humility, simply to try and trick my employer into promoting me to partner. It was this that I stammered out to the priest through the door. He said nothing in return, but slid the door open. Before me stood Mr. H.W. Towns. It wasn't a priest to whom I had confessed my sins. Furthermore, I realized I wasn't in a church at all. While debating whether or not I would confess my sins, I must have wandered back into town, safely, thankfully, and stopped in our city hall to warm up. It wasn't a confessional where I had confessed my sin. I had been speaking through the sliding front door of City Hall, and, of course, Mr. H.W. Towns was behind the door. He volunteered on weekends as the doorman, which was one of many philanthropic pursuits that made me respect him so. One of many that made me feel lucky to have found a mentor in him. I flinched, ready for him to castigate me, however uncharacteristically, for wasting coal and attempting to deceive him. Instead, he had a warm smile on his face. I could see tears welling in the bottom of his eyes, and he placed his hands on my shoulders. Herr Kurtz, your honesty, humility, and integrity speaks volumes to your character. Sure, we're all tempted from time to self-aggrandize, but the courage it took for you to admit your shortcomings is precisely what I need in a partner at H.W. Towns Insurance and Associates. Or should I say, Towns and Kurtz Insurance. My chin fell to the floor. You don't mean, I stammered. I do, partner, he replied, emphasizing partner. He put out his hand for a shake, but I responded with an embrace, and he hugged in return, patting me on the back. When we finally let go of one another, he reached into his breast pocket and pulled out the satin mayoral sash. This was given to me for safekeeping, he said. And I believe you have a speech to make. He put the sash on me and turned me around. The entire town had gathered in front of City Hall, eager for me to speak to them. At first, I was taken off guard, but then I took a deep breath and spoke from the heart. My dear fellow citizens, I began. It's an honor to be at your service. I know that together, we can improve this city. We can care for one another and pull ourselves out of our own selfish pursuits and focus more on those around us. But, I paused, before we do that, I believe I owe it to myself to subscribe to a few travel magazines.